Hello everyone out there, I'm Roy Carter and this is Rectitude Media. I'm covering a lot of local issues, but now I'd like to raise awareness of a serious global threat. I'm doing this video because I fear the direction in which this country is heading towards. Our government is using the pretext of fighting ISIS to fund terrorist groups in Syria and even neo-Nazis in Ukraine while pandering to the Zionists in Israel. Now I'm not saying that ISIS isn't real, nor am I saying that all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, or even that all Jewish people are Zionists. But the evidence is starting to become overwhelming, more and more. It keeps coming to the light of truth each passing day. The history of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and al-Nusra go pretty far back, but most notably during the Cold War. Enter Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski began to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet intervention. CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. Brzezinski himself had gone on record to say, "It was July 3rd, 1979 that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul." Brzezinski was then put in charge of supplying the Mujahideen with arms which led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This strategy was a complete success, and when asked if creating a government of tribal warlords, also known as the Taliban, was a wise decision, Brzezinski gloated, "What is most important to the history of the world? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War?" Those words would eventually come back to haunt him after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now don't get me wrong, I have no pity for the Soviet regime, but this ultimately led to the 2001 September 11 attacks on the World Trade Buildings. Let's not forget that there was heavy involvement with Saudi Arabia in their role in the September 11th attacks. I mean, come on. 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. And after the attacks, the US blatantly lied about them having any prior knowledge of an attack when 6 months prior the Bush administration was warned of a possible attack by the Taliban. Congress's investigative report on 9/11, dealing with specific sources of foreign support, had an 800-page report, and President George Bush redacted 28 pages of this report for probably nefarious reasons. Why would he be withholding crucial information from the world in his own Congress? An article from the New York Post clearly states that a pair of representatives, Walter Jones, Republican of North Carolina, and Stephen Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts, can't reveal the nation identified by it without violating federal law. So they've proposed Congress pass a resolution asking President Obama to declassify the entire 2002 report. Joint inquiry into intelligence community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. But did Canada or the US make any condemnation of a country that it has massive human rights abuses? Nope, we do business with them. They buy our armored vehicles, they train their doctors here, we hate on Iran together, and we both boast how great our oil reserves are. When Crown Prince Nayef bin Abdulaziz Al Saud died in June of 2012, then Foreign Minister John Baird gushed with praise, and I quote, "Saudi Arabia has lost an honorable man of great achievement who has dedicated his life to the security and prosperity of the people of Saudi Arabia. In fact, Nayef bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, Interior Minister for 3.5 decades, was considered an ultra-conservative member of the Al Saud family who resisted the weakening of Wahhabist doctrine as a threat to the monarchy's grip on power. When Defense Minister and Deputy Premier Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud died in October 2011, Baird issued a similar assessment. The kingdom has lost a man of great achievement who dedicated his life to the well-being of his people." Appointed Defense and Aviation Minister in 1962, Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud was a leading figure in the country for 5 decades. He pushed a stridently anti-communist position, but was implicated in a number of major corruption scandals. Harper even sold the wheat board to the Saudi-owned Global Grain Corporation because he'd rather sell out Canadian farmers who put in a bid to buy it and keep the wheat board genuinely Canadian the very year before. Now, I may seem to be going a little off topic here, but I'm just proving my case that if the Western powers really gave a damn about Wahhabist terrorists, they should have cut ties to the Saudis in Pakistan ages ago. After the Western Allied invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, a power vacuum was created, and Western-backed puppets like Hamid Karzai, who was leaking money to Al-Qaeda through secretive CIA funding, which eventually became exposed as the war ended and Western groups began leaving. Karzai even went to Dubai and Qatar to mediate talks with the US and Al-Qaeda. Now we arrive at yet another blunder of neoliberalist agenda: Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was a dictator by any measure. He would go to UN meetings dressed in the most bizarre attire and accuse Western powers of evil imperialism. The world put up with his quirkiness until just before the US-backed arming and airstrikes in Libya, when Gaddafi proposed creating an African gold-based currency to compete with the euro and the US petrodollar. Gaddafi's plan to quit selling Libyan oil in US dollars, demanding payment instead in gold-backed dinars, a single African currency made from gold, was the real cause. The regime, sitting on massive amounts of gold, estimated at close to 150 tons, was also pushing other African and Middle Eastern governments to follow suit. So what was the Western response? We used Al-Qaeda to take out the Libyan regime. Abdel Hakim al-Hasidi, the Libyan rebel leader, has said jihadists who fought against Allied troops in Iraq were on the front lines of the battle against Muammar Gaddafi's regime. After Gaddafi's death, over 100 tons of gold was stolen from Libya by NATO forces, and Wahhabist groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda were given full control of northern Africa and Libya. This led to another muck-up of US foreign policy, Benghazi. For years, we were told by the Obama administration that Benghazi was caused by an Innocence of Muslim video, and that they had no prior knowledge of this. And up until a few weeks ago, there wasn't much concrete evidence to prove otherwise. But after a couple of years of battling the State Department and the Department of Defense, governmental watchdog Judicial Watch received a heavily redacted document through a Freedom of Information request, which showed that the Obama administration knew 10 days prior of a potential attack and yet did nothing to help out former U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans, and they sacrificed them, even going so far as to provide transportation and arms from Libya to Syria. They even list Al-Qaeda as a military asset instead of a fucking terrorist organization. The fully disclosed document is available in the links, which I recommend people view for themselves, to grasp the scope of just how Hegelian this whole U.S. foreign policy has become. And we've all been duped into believing it by the U.S. and the mainstream media outlets. Now, I'm not just blaming the U.S.'s involvement in this, as our own Prime Minister was completely gung-ho for U.S. foreign policy straight from the start. I mean, let's not forget, we joined the NATO initiative and bombed strategic installations, paving the way for Al-Qaeda groups to spread and destabilize already conflicted African nations. Stephen Harper praised the removal of Gaddafi in 2011 as, quote, a day of honor. He would go on to eat those words in 2015 when now newly formed ISIS beheaded up to 21 Egyptian Coptic Orthodox Christians in Libya. Yet the media failed to put 2 and 2 together, that we had helped this slaughter come to fruition. So let's go back to the branching of Al-Qaeda into Al-Nusra, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Just a few days after Benghazi, a huge shipment of weapons arrived in Turkey via a Libyan cargo ship, which was reported on by the London Times. Among more than 400 tons of cargo, the vessel was carrying SAM-7 surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles and rocket-propelled grenades. This was to be used by the Free Syrian Army and the Muslim Brotherhood to topple Assad's regime in Syria. Any mention of the fact that the rebels fighting Assad's regime were well-established international terrorist groups was just ignored, or covered minimally without explanation. The Western-backed superpowers then began using buzzwords like moderate rebel groups to create an intellectual buzzword to hide atrocities that were being carried out by US-funded terrorist groups. In an interview given in April of 2014, Free Syrian Army commander Jamal Marouf admitted to conducting joint operations with al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, for a really awesome documentary that fully explains the maneuvering of al-Nusra, the Muslim Brotherhood, and ISIS. I really suggest watching Stormcloud's Gatherings Covert Origins of ISIS video. Now, you can find that either on their site or on their YouTube channel. In June of 2013, al-Nusra merged with ISIS on the Iraqi border, and ISIS was at full strength. Around this time, the war rhetoric from the US, UK, Canada, and Australia started to beat the war drums of intervention based on humanitarian grounds. When most of the dumbed-down population was more concerned about Miley Cyrus's drug-propelled twerking at the MMVA, NATO allied countries were using the chemical sarin gas attack in Syria as an excuse to invade Syria. There was only one problem with this claim, though. It was entirely false. An independent investigation revealed by the UN and other observers blamed the attack solely on the Free Syrian Army as a false flag to get NATO directly involved in the conflict. When this came to light, the Obama administration was willing to interfere legally anyways, despite many protests, even from their own Air Force members, who created a social media campaign risking their jobs and even imprisonment with a simple message: "We will not be Al-Qaeda's Air Force." What stopped the interventionist neoliberal agenda for that time being in its tracks was Vladimir Putin's direct opposition to interventionist policy. This perceived act of treason by the rest of the G7 nations would not stand for the global elite and their agenda, and subsequently began the downward spiral into a new Cold War, renewing old hatreds long thought cooled over. The sanctions from the UN started flying, and the demonization of Russia began to take center stage in neocon policies around the world. Now, I'm not lionizing Russia. Any country that jails their opposition after they win an election on trumped-up bogus charges or denies people equal rights is not a place where I would want to live or raise my kids in. With ISIS gaining ground and support from the very same moderate rebels that we funded started to join ISIS, U.S. foreign policy switched from destabilization to the Middle East to destabilization of Russia. Enter George Soros. After a meeting in Davos in 2011, Soros boasted he had a Libyan-style plan for Ukraine, well before the installation of Western-backed puppet Poroshenko. Soros even went on to admit in an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria that his NGOs, his non-government organizations, were directly responsible for inciting the Maidan riots. Once again, I recommend anybody listening to check out Stormcloud Gatherings' YouTube channel or website for all of their videos on the Odessa massacre and the rise of the far-right neo-Nazi groups that have came to power. The BBC even reported on the rise of neo-Nazis in Ukraine right after the Orange Revolution. With the resistance of southeastern Ukrainians with Russian sympathies, the propaganda war was being waged on both sides. Instead of staying out of the conflict or pushing for a peaceful two-state solution, Canada, the US, the UK, and other allies began arming and training neo-Nazis to slaughter villagers and destroy dissension. Meanwhile, nothing was mentioned about this in the media, as everyone became brainwashed back into a neo-McCarthyist agenda of Russia's scapegoating. There was no mention about the gay pride protest that was pretty much destroyed because of a bunch of Svobodan neo-Nazis that didn't like the idea of gays marching in the streets. There was no mention of the Jewish rabbis that had to leave the country because they were getting their houses firebombed in the middle of the night, or even all of the Holocaust memorial graves that they had and the cemeteries that were being defaced. There was no mention of that, which I think is ridiculous. See, whichever side of the Ukrainian civil war you side with, it will never justify Western countries funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Harper supports neo-Nazis. Obama supports neo-Nazis. Cameron supports neo-Nazis. and Tony Abbott supports neo-Nazis. All because Russia wouldn't play nice at the giant G8 table of global elitism. Now I leave anyone watching this video with a very pertinent question. Was all of this just a series of egregious errors and coincidences? Or can you see the pattern of problem-reaction-solution-based politics that have been engineered for decades? Either way, this isn't a conspiracy anymore. There's more than enough evidence out there, and you just have to look for it yourself. Links, videos, and US State Department documents can all be accessed in the links below. I also recommend that if you don't like reading long redacted documents, like the damning Judicial Watch's Freedom of Information request, that Dan Dix from Press from Truth has a great video titled "We Are ISIS" that really exposes the threat of ISIS for what it is, a product of direct military interventionist policy of a Hegelian dialectic agenda. That is completely real, but a monster of our own creation. This has been Roy Carter from Rectitude Media, and thank you very much for listening.